name is Alfred and this is my final project for Education 240. I have decided to explore how alienation occurs in the educational system and what can be done to combat this to create a better environment for the students in the future. First of all, in explaining what is alienation from a Marxist perspective, essentially this is what occurs when you have workers who work for money. However, it isn't for themselves. They're working for the money strictly for their survival. So they're basically doing repetitive tasks for a boss. So the higher ups can benefit from their labor. But what occurs from this is that the workers are very detached from their jobs as they are just doing this again for the money. So they don't have this internal motivation to achieve more goals as their only goal is to earn money no matter the repetitive, boring tasks they're doing every day. So, in this sense, when we explain this into the educational system, it is essentially when teachers tell students, hey, this is what you need to do in class, this is what you have to do, this is what you're going to study, this is what you're going to memorize for the test. The students are not actually engaged and they are not actually motivated to do the task or know why they need to do the task, but they're just doing it strictly because they have to. So this is explaining what alienation is in a Marxist perspective. Here, I would like to take a look at some impacts of alienation on school system in a traditional system by a specific article that we have already read in lecture, which is Alienated Learning in Hong Kong by Sang. So essentially here I have concluded a few key points and effects to students, which includes the feeling of inferiority, which basically occurs when traditional systems use exams as a huge portion of deeming success for the students. And in this case, it could make students who aren't successful based on the grading scale from the exams. This could cause them to feel disconnected and lose interest in their learning as they feel like they are, not meant for it or they're just basically a failure in learning or they're not as good as other people, which can cause a huge loss of self-confidence. And the traditional educational system obviously stick with old-fashioned teaching ways a lot, which includes essentially just memorization, which is essentially just for the exam. So you have an exam, you have content, you'll basically try to just force yourself to memorize it for as long as you can, just for the exam day. When the exam is over, you'll forget all of it. Might sound familiar. So essentially, there is a huge lack of emphasis on actual critical thinking and evaluating students based on, their personal hobbies and growth and exploring what they are good at, but instead use a traditional, just generic scale for everyone. And essentially, if you can memorize content, you can get a good grade, and then you will be deemed as successful, which is basically the impact of alienation on the school system and how this can affect students negatively. So, having established a baseline on how the traditional system is, we discuss now what we also learned in our course, the holistic education. And a key example being what we learned is the Equinox School. So what does this school does? Basically, they are focused on external development for students. So here are some specific features from the school. They are focused on having students in the outdoor, connecting with nature away from in the classroom to build a strong personality as a baseline for how they can later on advance in education. So they are having a strong emphasis on feeling confident in their own identity and be confident in having their own personal skills. And of course, there is actually a huge emphasis on learning outdoor as well. So rather than be in the classroom just scribbling away on a textbook, notebook, they are often outside in the nature, learning about, for example, if you're learning about birds or nature in science class, you can go outside and actually explore, birds nest outside and leaves and all that sort of stuff in a more natural way, away from being in the classroom, but actually being in nature and making those explorations. So This is essentially a way more different approach from traditional school. So this is essentially what the Equinox School is, and they are under the Toronto School Board District. So they are considered as a public education school. In this side, we are comparing the traditional system against the holistic school system. There's obviously pros and cons to both. First of all, in comparing the structure and flexibility, the traditional school system is obviously more standardized and they have a very strict procedure to follow. Exam preparations for university, stuff like that. You know, the courses you have to take, the marks you have to get, that sort of things. The Equinox approach offers way more flexibility, so you can obviously, it's not even about mostly being in the classroom, but mostly about personal growth and development and creating a strong identity, so you can be your own person and finding hobbies of you know sorts that interest you. In terms of stress, it's very obvious that a traditional system will place way more stress on you as there is the generic scale of exams to deem how successful you are in classes. And Equinox systems, obviously, more engaging, less stressful, more focused on gaining experiences and learning in nature rather than having exam scores as a determination of how successful you are. The next two kind of similar, social and emotional growth. So essentially, traditional system again focused on pushing your upward mobility, emphasize on exams. However, this could lead to alienation due to you are basically trained to just fit into the mold, achieve what you have to, while the Equinox system is focused on nurturing your identity, creativity, to make you not stressful and trying to promote the learning experience to be a positive environment. So all in all, the traditional system is the way to go in the sense of going to a higher education with a very clear path, but it can lead to alienation again and also a lot of stress along the way, as we know. Equinox system provides a nurturing environment. However, due to the lack of the standard way of exam scores as well, obviously, being the way to determine your success, often is not very clear in the sense of how how successful and how well you're doing, as most of the goal from Equinox system is your personal growth and how you are doing better for yourself as a person and discovering new hobbies and that sort of. In this slide, I would like to raise the article that we read, written by Paulo Freire, and some of his main ideas about the oppressed and how he has his views. So essentially, what he is focused on is that in education, what should be focused on is how students should be embraced to their humanity, basically what makes them human, aka personalities, hobbies, all of that sort of thing. And he argues that in this educational system, the teachers are basically the ones that have this false generosity and kind of this thing where, hey, they're doing what's good for you, they know what's better, and that basically keeps them in power over their students. And of course, there is another aspect on Paulo believing that the oppressed, so in this case, it would be the students, they have to challenge this oppression from their oppressors and bring the changes for themselves. And Paulo also argues that education must be centered around students. So if we are saying that the education is for the students, it needs to be centered around the students in order to create a more beneficial environment into the students' own critical thinking so they can have their own personal growth. So putting together what Paulo has raised in his key ideas, there is three factors here on how this applies to students. So essentially, students need to examine their own internalized beliefs. They need to understand like there is that oppression there, and they need to be empowered to change that, to participate, like they have to choose their own learning in that sense. But however, for this to occur, they need the system rather would need the teacher to be able to create that environment to give the opportunity for the students to take charge of their own education and personal understanding in order for the students to reshape this future for themselves. So it comes from both the teacher giving the environment and the students to have their internal understanding that they need to push themselves for their own learning and their own personal growth. In all of this, the teachers do hold a huge power and ability to break down that traditional hierarchy and oppression on the students by how they choose to do the teaching. For example, the students could feel more motivated by teachers being more of a promoter and supporter role rather than a traditional teacher role, in the sense of like a teacher could be like, hey, this is the topic today, do some self-reflection, how would this make you feel better, and just kind of motivates the students to do their own thinking rather than be like, this is the info today, memorize this, do the test, and you'll get a grade. Because that's pretty closed off thinking. What we are trying to promote or present is creating more in an equal and inclusive learning environment for the students to do more critical thinking and reflection for their own, so they can have more personal growth on finding their own identity. Raising another example of an article that we have learned in our classrooms is called Two-Eyed Seeing by Marshall. So what Marshall is bringing to the table is that speaking how education is not just strictly on education, in the sense that there's so much more that you can learn about in the education system that isn't strictly basically textbook information. So there's ideas such as integration of multiple perspectives, so blending the indigenous and Western knowledge into a system and collaborating those. There's co-learning, fostering connections and respect, holistic development. So it's basically essentially saying like, from your traditional learning of just textbook information and doing exams for grades, it is so important to learn so much more different aspects of education in our society, which could, it could be about like social experience on how, in life, what to do in life, not just, memorizing textbooks, and to learn about different cultures and integrating cultures into learning so you can learn different perspectives in life, and that will take you further as an individual rather than just learning textbook information, which could make you book smart. However, it is important to learn different aspects of education. That is basically the key point from Marshall. And another article from week 1 of our course is by Palmer, and this focuses greatly on the teacher. Everything we've discussed here so far is greatly related to the teacher, as at the end of the day, in the classroom, they do deliver the information, and they are so critical to the growth of students and their self-confidence and all those sort of things for the future. So we have to do our part to support the teacher in the sense of understanding the teacher also have their own personal inner life. Teachers obviously have their emotional challenges. So teachers are obviously humans as well, and they need that support with the immense amount of pressure and their role in the sense of having to deliver a specific curriculum, but as well as trying to do their part to bring what's good for their students in the way that they can, focus less on the educational side, but putting more time into more valued critical thinking for their own future and learning, what hobbies they like to do and how they can do better instead of just, memorizing textbook for the exam and forget it in the traditional way of learning. So finally, I would like to discuss some of my ideas after bringing all the points I mentioned together on the ideal future for more incorporation of a holistic school system to reduce alienation. So as we all know, alienation, again, basically having students follow what the teacher says, repetitive task, not really interested, bores them, not really motivated, but they're just doing it basically just for the sake of needing to do it. So in order to make education more valuable to students and actually having them grow and develop, here are 4 ideas that I believe would be integrated into a educational system that would be beneficial. So this includes integrate 2I that we discussed with indigenous knowledge, I believe it is important to integrate different views in our educational system. It is simple to, have your own view and use that as a judge or as like a threshold of where you're from in a way to like use that as the norm to judge. But I feel like especially in a country that we live in Canada, it is important to understand there are so many different perspectives, and having that respect for different cultures as well will be greatly helpful in reducing cultural alienation. Second of all, emphasize social emotional learning. So essentially, yeah, there's not just mathematics, all those core subjects and stuff, but it is extremely important to focus on, self awareness and a personal, interpersonal skill level. Just being healthy, having emotional intelligence rather than just academic intelligence. Thirdly, culturally responsive teaching and inclusive curriculum. So yeah, change the curriculum to become more diverse, to accept more different cultures, languages, experience. Teach more about this rather than just having again a standard level of what you need to learn in each grade. And lastly, holistic health support. So obviously, mental state, physical health, emotional health. Often when we are under severe pressure from the normal traditional way of school, it is easy to neglect personal health. So I believe it is important to integrate this into the educational system. So I believe, yeah, all those 4 points are crucial, and they could be slowly integrated in order to create more of a holistic school system, which can hopefully have the idea of school system to be less of like a boring and just textbook style of education, but however, for education to become something that you think about that will improve you as a person in all aspects. It should be able to for people to think about education and be like, I want to improve my mental health, I want to improve my physical health, I want to learn about other cultures, and just be inclusive to all aspects of life, which you can actually have more personal growth in, rather than just educational and university and jobs. Yeah, that is what's incorporated, and yeah, what is different from traditional, and hopefully a more holistic school system in the future. So having been born in Shanghai, China, and having attended their school system up until the age of 10, I would like to make a comparison from what I have personally just experienced, from starting grade 5 in Canada and grade 1 to 5 in Shanghai. So, in the Shanghai traditional school system, I definitely had a experience on a very strong emphasis on discipline. So when you're in class, the way you sit, the way you raise your hand, is all very disciplined. So, for example, when you sit, you have to, sit straight at the table. Your arms are on the table. When you raise your hand, it's like a 90-degree raise of your hand. And yeah, again, you don't speak when the teacher's talking. If you're talking, you can stand outside the door, that sort of stuff. So it is extremely, there's a focus on discipline. It is very competitive in the sense of, for example, if grades, oftentimes after a test, your grades will be posted openly on the class whiteboard or outside on by the door. So it is trying to create basically a very intense style of competitiveness, in the sense of if you're doing badly or poorly, it will be known to the whole class. So it kind of embarrasses you in a way to hopefully motivate you to do better, because